A question I get asked fairly often is my martial art useful? To which I usually respond, useful for what? Are you trying to learn to fight, or are you just trying to get in shape? Or is this more of a spiritual endeavor for you? Because at the end of the day, everything is useful in the right context. So, while the title of this video might imply that I'm ranking martial arts from best to worst, instead, we're going to use this handy-dandy little plot graph that I made to figure out the various quadrants of usefulness a martial art can have. And by the way, for those of you who don't know, my name's Rob. I'm a Muay Thai and karate instructor with over 18 years of experience. So the way this is going to work is that our arts are going to be judged on a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, we have fight utility. In this context, fighting can mean whatever you want it to mean. MMA, street fighting, personal protection. When two or more people are involved in hand-to-hand combat, we're going to call that a fight. On the other end of the spectrum, we have non-combat focused training. And that can be exactly what you think it is. That's stuff like forms, maybe something like cardio kickboxing. If you're not focusing on hurting another human being, that's non-combat focused training. Personal development can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. It can mean anything from fitness to spiritual health to actual heart health. The last aspect of our graph is going to be rules and restrictions. Because while a martial art can place a lot of emphasis on fighting, their style of fighting might have so many rules imposed on it that you can only specifically do it in a specific room with a specific rule set. With that out of the way, let's talk about our first martial art, Kyokushin. For those who don't know, Kyokushin is a karate style focused on close range, bare knuckle striking, and savage, beautiful kicks. Now, I personally love Kyokushin. I think it's one of the best striking methods out there, and I think it best exemplifies what karate culture is all about. But if I'm being honest, while I want to put it very high up in the fight utility, we also have to talk about the elephant in the room. Original OG Kyokushin doesn't allow punches to the face, which immediately takes it from being very high up to a little more over to the rules and restrictions. But I do see a very high emphasis on spiritual development and discipline in Kyokushin. So we're going to move Kyokushin over to high fight utility and high personal development. Let's talk about Judo. Judo is another Japanese style, but where Kyokushin focuses on striking, Judo focuses on grappling, particularly of the standing variety. Although there is a lot of ground grappling in Judo as well, so we're going to take that into consideration. Now at this point, Judo is mostly a sport, so it should rank fairly high in fight utility. But again, there's some wonky rules that we need to talk about. There's no leg attacks, and there's not a lot of ground grappling done in mainline Judo. Not to mention, Judo competitions have to be done in a gi, and a lot of its techniques don't work unless your opponent is wearing that big heavy jacket. So again, Judo, like Kyokushin, ranks pretty high up in fight utility, but pretty much along the same lines when it comes to rules and restrictions. Wing Chun is a kung fu system, which like Kyokushin, focuses on close range striking, but instead of focusing on power and angling, focuses on extreme speed and hand trapping. And of course, we can't talk about Wing Chun without mentioning straight blast. It's literally what the art is known for, and it led directly to the development of Jeet Kune Do. But at the same time, Wing Chun isn't exactly known for creating the best fighters in the modern day. So Wing Chun is going to sit over here in this fourth quadrant. It's not totally focused on weapons and form training, so it still goes pretty high towards fight utility, but the rule set does require that you stand square in close range with the opponent. So it's going to move away from fight utility and personal development right there to the middle of the fourth quadrant. I think that's pretty fair. All right, let's talk now about Budo Taijutsu. Budo Taijutsu, also known as Bujinkan, Genbukan, Jininkan, or more popularly and most often, ninjutsu, is the art of the ninja. Now there's a lot more to the whole of ninjutsu than just hand-to-hand combat. There's stealth tactics, there's military operations, there's all kinds of stuff. But in this context, we're talking only about the hand-to-hand combat methods that supposedly the ninjas used. In my personal experience, Budo Taijutsu has some very fun techniques and it teaches you some cool fighting theory, but in terms of actually learning how to fight, there's a lot lacking. Now I know its supporters will say it takes you 10 plus years to learn how to actually use Budo Taijutsu, but for me that's just too long to actually get good at something. But I will say the people who love Budo Taijutsu seem to love Budo Taijutsu. And I've seen countless people who devoted themselves purely to it and get a lot of spiritual and personal growth out of it. So I'm actually gonna move it over towards our third quadrant over here, A, just so we can fill it out, but B, because I do think it's more of a spiritual pursuit than a physical pursuit. Now, MMA is pretty straightforward. There is no non-combat focused training, but at the same time, there are some pretty significant rules and restrictions in MMA. You can't gouge the eyes, you can't kick the down opponent, there's never going to be more than one opponent. There's plenty of things in MMA that still restrict it from being a totally perfect martial art. But still, even with that in mind, I'm going to place it pretty high up in fight utility and just move it over, let's move it down a little bit too. Let's do Choy Li Foot next. Choy Li Foot replicates the untamed power of the haymaker and utilizes it to almost scientific accuracy. There are plenty of videos of people exclusively trained in Choy Li Foot doing extremely well in Muay Thai, kickboxing, and MMA. But at the same time, there's a lot of form work in Choy Li Foot, so I'm going to put Choy Li Foot over here on the same line as Kyokushin, but just underneath Judo. Let's talk now about the internet's favorite martial art, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Being honest, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu should rank as high as MMA in fight utility, but as it stands right now, Jiu-Jitsu seems to be extremely focused with getting yourself to the ground and inviting your opponent to come with you, rather than bringing them there yourself. I'm not saying that's the only focus of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, that's just by and large where the culture is at. However, that's not to say that Jiu-Jitsu doesn't address how to take someone down to the ground effectively in a realistic manner, so it's not going to score all the way down to the bottom. But just like Kyokushin, I think you'll find that people that practice Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu are rabid for it. I think more than any other martial art in the 21st century, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu has created a powerful, engaging culture where you're either in or you're out. And the people who buy into it develop almost a Shaolin monk level of devotion to their training. I think this is a good spot for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Still very high in fight utility, but also gives you a lot for your personal growth. Dambe is the first of these martial arts that I'm familiar with, but don't actually know that much about. To my knowledge, it's a Nigerian martial art which is mostly focused on boxing with a little bit of kicking. And instead of wearing protective gloves on both hands, contestants wrap their hands in a very powerful cast to use their strong hand as their strong hand. But because it's only wrapping one hand in that super strong cast, most techniques circle around that one hand, meaning the defense, head movement, and variability of the striking is pretty limited. That doesn't mean it's a bad striking system. That just means the things that make Dambe great put it at kind of a disadvantage when faced with other, more holistic striking systems. On the other side of the spectrum, we have freestyle karate, which is kind of hard to get a definition of. The most basic definition of karate is any time you take more than one traditional martial art, karate, taekwondo, tang soo do, whatever, and blend it with another style to be used in point fighting. But based on what I'm seeing, freestyle karate equally involves point fighting competitions as it does kata and weapons demonstrations. And as we know, that is a non-combat focus. So I'm gonna put freestyle karate right here at the tippy top of this quadrant. Let's talk about Muay Thai. Now, as I said, I'm a Muay Thai instructor. I've been doing Muay Thai for 6 years at this point. I love the style, but we're here to address things honestly. So obviously Muay Thai will rank pretty high up in fight utility. However, I am gonna move Muay Thai over a little bit more towards rules and restrictions because the things that make Muay Thai great for striking make it awful for grappling. Now look, nothing else in the martial arts world looks like Muay Thai clinching. It is one of the most beautiful, unique things to the whole style. However, because Muay Thai is about creating a dynamic, beautiful striking system, the most effective thing you can do in the Muay Thai clinch is grab onto someone and throw devastating knees and elbows to them. Not that that's not effective, but it does stunt the way you approach grappling and wrestling. Not to mention, for as effective and beautiful as Muay Thai striking is, I do think we're seeing a shift away from just standing in front of your opponent and trading shots into more of a footwork and head movement heavy style of striking. So Muay Thai I'm going to place over here on the right side of quadrant 2. I think it's just as effective as Judo, but the clinch work is a little restrictive and it leaves something to be desired in terms of movement. Let's talk about Defense Lab. For those of you that don't know, Defense Lab is the next generation of the KC fighting method. If you don't know what that is, it's this. Now in my experience, self-defense training seems to fall into one of two camps. Either A, your training is primarily focused on jiu-jitsu, as in tying up your opponent and putting them on the ground, or B, focused primarily on striking, primarily in the straight blast style of striking. In other words, direct, explosive, straightforward pressure. With that in mind, it seems like Defense Lab is pretty wholly focused on that second camp, driving forward and striking as many targets as possible as effectively and quickly as possible. The thing about Defense Lab, and a lot of styles like it, is that their goal isn't necessarily to make the best fighters of all time, it's to teach untrained people as quickly as possible how to become effective against an untrained attacker. So while it might seem like their fight utility is very high, that only goes to a certain level. But what I'm gonna do is move Defense Lab to the far end of personal development, because martial arts whose main focus is about teaching people to turn on aggression at the drop of a hat are all about personal development. But in this case, it's not about spiritual refinement, it's not about getting fit, it's about learning how to decide when you're being threatened and how to handle it. Wrestling is going to be a little bit hard to talk about just because it's an umbrella term and not a specific martial art. But for the purpose of this conversation, pick your favorite form of wrestling. Now, we don't need to have a debate about this. Wrestling is going to score very high in fight utility. It's about becoming the most explosive, most athletic version of yourself that you can become. The training isn't concerned with you becoming wise and enlightened, although people can definitely become monks for wrestling. And the rules are a little restrictive in that, again, you're not striking and the goal is to only pin your opponent down. There's not a lot of grappling once you get to the ground, but the goal isn't just to throw them down, it's to hold them down. Particularly holding an opponent down in a way that prevents them from being able to grapple you. So when you think about it, the only real anti-grappling out there is wrestling. I'm gonna change things up a little bit here. I know I have Defendu written right now, but that's honestly kind of similar to Defense Lab and Krav Maga. So we're actually gonna modify this from Defendu to Combatives. Now, you might not think that makes that big of a difference, but it does. Because as I said, Defendu, the Fairbairn system, is pretty similar to what Krav Maga has turned into, not in a bad way, that just is what it is. But Combatives is a very different thing altogether. As I said a moment ago, there's really two different camps of self-defense training. There's the straight blast striking method and the everything is jiu-jitsu method. And Combatives is pretty firmly in the jiu-jitsu camp. Their core philosophy is about taking hold of an opponent, putting them on the ground, ideally on their belly, and then getting yourself away as quickly as possible with as minimal damage to them as possible. I have a lot of respect for Defense Lab and systems like it, but in terms of practicality and what is usually legally permissible, I think Combatives training is a much better way to go, particularly if you are military or police and you have to restrain people without actually hurting them. As far as non-combat focused training goes, in a good Combatives program, they are focusing on weapons training and pre-fight indicators and how to de-escalate. So what I'm gonna do is put Combatives over here, pretty much on the middle of the line, and move it down, not because it's any worse at fighting, but because they do have to focus on gun and knife training, which for our purposes is non-combat training. Do you like free gear? So do I. That's why I've partnered with today's sponsor, X Martial, to bring you a special promotion. X Martial and I are offering $100 to one of my viewers to spend on whatever they want across the website. This includes their wide catalog of t-shirts, shorts, rash guards, and all kinds of training gear. All you have to do to enter is comment down below what kind of gear you need to pick up, and I'll pick one commenter at random within a week of this video dropping, and we'll get in touch about how you can pick up your voucher. So, good luck and happy training. So the astute among you might have noticed that we have HEMA over here on the list. But earlier I said our combat is going to focus on hand-to-hand fighting and not weapons combat. So what gives? Well, I'm not trying to weasel out of this and say that HEMA, because it has so many different types of weapons, is ultimately about using your hands as a weapon. Instead, my argument is, can weapons training teach you how to fight empty-handed? Which is also going to be kind of the conversation we have about Filipino martial arts in a minute, but we'll get to that. My answer to that is, in general, no, but kind of. Because for me, the Mr. Miyagi style of training, as in creating muscle memory by doing random chores or unrelated tasks, isn't actually the best way to train somebody. Are there some carryovers between sword fighting tactics or axe fighting tactics or whatever and empty hand tactics? Sure. But can you necessarily learn how to defend yourself empty-handed just by training with weapons? I'm skeptical of that. What I will say about HEMA and other weapons-based systems is that they seem to develop very stoic, very disciplined people. I think there's something about training with live weapons that teaches people how to be disciplined and how to be focused. Since we're talking about weapon systems, let's talk about the most infamous one on the internet, Filipino martial arts. And in this case, we're gonna lump together Kali, Eskrima, and Arnis all together because they're pretty similar. Yes, I know they're very different and there's 104 different subsystems, whatever, they're Filipino martial arts. With that being said, we are not going to talk about utilizing sticks or knives or machetes. We're going to talk about the empty hand variations that Filipino martial arts purports to teach by using sticks, knives, swords, and machetes. I think Filipino martial arts empty hands, or panantukit if you prefer it that way, is very effective, is very beautiful, and is very unique. But I think their training methodology leaves a lot to be desired. Because from what I've seen, their training relies on having compliant, willing partners to work through pre-choreographed drills over and over and over again. And at the same time, I think the concept of treating empty hands the exact same way you do with loaded hands kind of weakens the way you actually strike. Look, I know defanging the snake is a very cool thing to do, but it's much more effective when you have a stick in your hand than when you're trying to hammer fist somebody's bicep. However, I think that boxing, as in the four-knuckle striking method of Filipino martial arts, can be very effective. There's just a lot of stuff that doesn't actually transfer from weapons to empty hand. Moving along, let's talk about Bokator. What is Bokator? It is the Cambodian sister to the Thai Muay Boran. You can think of Muay Boran and Muay Thai as the exact same thing, but one is the sport aspect of a martial art and the other is the warfare version of the martial art. And Cambodia and Thailand developed very closely as far as martial arts goes. Now the reason I'm talking about Bokator and not Muay Boran is because there's a lot of people that love Bokator that want to see it featured on the internet and I need more views. That being said, is Bokator or Muay Boran or Muay Chaya or whatever, our traditional forms of combat, still viable in the 21st century? My argument, yes. I think the downside in only ever training in combat sports is that you get used to very specific rules of engagement. Plus, if you only ever train in gloves, training without gloves is a very different experience. So I think something like Bokator is a great way to expand your Muay Thai training, but I don't think it should be your only form of training. With that in mind, I'm going to put Bokator just over here in moderate fight utility, but mostly focused on personal development. Because let's face it, if you're training only in a traditional style like this, it's because you want to learn the history and the culture, not because you want to learn to fight quickly. All right, I don't want to save all the hate for the very end, so let's talk about Aikido right now. Now, as you might have seen in this video right here, I actually do have a lot of respect for Aikido. I think it's a very beautiful, very functional martial art in its own way. But in terms of this spectrum, where does Aikido sit? Aikido is not concerned with fighting. Aikido is focused on not fighting. And I'm not saying that philosophically. I mean, Aikido's primary philosophy is about using ambush attacks on unwilling or unsuspecting opponents. Now, that might sound dirty, but hear me out here. Aikido is primarily based on the practitioner developing intuition and learning how to read pre-fight indicators to be able to intercept an attacker before they actually attack them. Now, this falls apart once someone gets a drop on you and tries to hit you more than once, but used in its proper context, Aikido is very effective. So, I don't think Aikido is only a spiritual endeavor, and I don't think it's totally useless, but I don't think its use is for fighting. While we're at it, let's talk about the internet's second favorite punching bag, Taekwondo. Taekwondo is primarily a point fighting system, and point fighting can seem kind of ridiculous, but the fact is, point fighters can also be very powerful and very explosive. Where I would rank Taekwondo below karate is that their system is primarily based on only kicking. Yes, there are punches in Taekwondo, but most wins and the most impressive wins are done by the kicks. But minimizing the striking and completely ignoring the grappling results in a system that can get easily shut down by someone who knows how to deal with the kicks. So what I'm going to do is put Taekwondo probably the farthest towards non-combat focused training. If you're interested in learning how to point fight and doing forms and doing extremely athletic acrobatic kicks, Taekwondo is the way to go. If you want to learn to fight someone in a cage, maybe try something else. Boxing. We don't have to have a long conversation about this, right? If wrestling is the highest form of fighting on this list, then boxing deserves to be right there alongside it, right? It's never that simple with me. Boxing should be your first, best, and only option if you want to learn to fight using your hands. But when compared to wrestling, and honestly every other martial art on this list, boxing is also the most restrictive way to learn how to fight. Because you can only fight using the front of your knuckles in padded gloves. You can't clinch, you can't elbow, you can't knee, you can't throw, you most certainly can't grapple. But while it does make it a very restrictive style of fighting, what it's managed to do with only its two hands and its footwork and its defensive capabilities makes it one of the best ways of fighting. You can think about it a bit like this. When you have 64 different crayons in the box, it becomes very difficult to figure out which shade of blue the sky is closest to. However, when you only have 8 crayons in a box, you get very good at utilizing those 8 crayons. So what I'm going to do is put boxing over here on the far right of the quadrant because it is a very restrictive rule set, but above Dambe because you have both hands available to you as opposed to just one, and at the same line as MMA. Should we talk about American Kenpo? I think it's about time. I think American Kenpo and all of its derivatives and offshoots is a very good traditional martial art. You learn awesome techniques, beautiful forms, some weapons, and you get a very good cultural experience out of it. But I don't think fighting is one of the things you get out of it. And yeah, the training methodology of Kenpo is something that also needs to be addressed. If someone is throwing a static punch and you holding in place while you're doing 2, 3, 4, 7 moves, it's not gonna work. I don't care how you justify it, it's not a good way to train. I think if you're being really honest with yourself, nobody's ever gonna pull off half of those things in a real fight. And if you're trying to pull off some of these techniques, you're probably gonna go to prison. But with that in mind, I think Kenpo can go over here in this third quadrant, certainly above Budo Taijutsu. I do think its techniques and training is more athletic than Taijutsu, so it goes above that. But I don't think it goes in quadrant number 1 either. So it'll be our highest style, probably just below freestyle karate, which is funny because American Kenpo contributes a lot to freestyle karate. Let's talk now about a style I'm very excited about, Bartitsu, the English gentleman's art of Sherlock Holmes. Now, traditionally, we have to admit, Bartitsu has looked kind of ridiculous. It's always a photo of some big mustachioed man shaking an umbrella at somebody else. But in practice, I think Bartitsu is actually very interesting because for the most part, it's just combining bare knuckle boxing and Jiu-Jitsu. At the same time, I've also seen Bartitsu training be not just about how to fight, but how to avoid a fight. So my inclination is to put Bartitsu over here in quadrant number 2 because it does seem very fight focused. But if you're training in Bartitsu, that's what you went looking for. You want that kind of culture, that kind of exposure to help you as a person. So I'm actually gonna move it over here and probably just about the same level as Kyokushin. I think that's a good home for it. So we talked about American Kenpo with the N, but now let's talk about Nippon Kempo with an M, which sounds like it should be a very similar style, and it is, but it isn't. For the most part, Nippon Kempo, or Japanese Kenpo, is a kickboxing style, done in the gi, wearing chest and head protectors. But it is an extremely savage version of kickboxing. If you watch these fights, these guys are hitting full force and getting devastating knockouts. It's one of the first and most effective forms of full contact fighting. Whereas Taekwondo came out in the 1960s and Kaiju Kenpo came out in the 1940s, Nippon Kempo was already doing full contact free fighting in the 1930s. With that in mind, I think we can very easily put Nippon Kempo pretty high in fight utility and just about the same level as Dambe. Because if you are wearing chest and head protection, it's very hard to learn to move without them. But it's still a very effective form of learning how to fight. And now we've come to the last style, and this is my favorite style to talk about, Shin Kicking. What is Shin Kicking, you might ask? Well, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's two people kicking each other in the shins. Maybe they have straw tucked up their pants sleeve, maybe they don't, but the idea is to kick each other as hard as possible and see who gives up first. There's not much else to say about this style except for that it's bonkers to watch. So where does Shin Kicking fall on our spectrum? Shin Kicking sits the farthest towards rules and restrictions, but also the highest on our list because they're probably the best at fighting by only kicking someone's shins. So what do you guys think of this graph? Do you agree with my rankings? Do you disagree? Comment down below, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And with all that being said, I hope you enjoyed the video and I hope you learned something. If you did, please make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and don't forget to ring that bell. As well, check out my description box or the pinned comment down below. There you'll find my affiliate code for xmartial.com, which provides some of the best training apparel on the planet. As well, if you or somebody you know is a gym owner and is looking for a member management app, I highly recommend Gym Desk. There's a link down in my description as well. All that being said, this has been Rob from Combat Self-Defense. I want to thank you for all the hard work. Thank you for the hard work yet to be done, and I'll see you next time.